Hey there.
How's your trip?
Had a good trip.
Jealous of you. I looked for you on the TV, but they had too many people look like you, so I quit looking. Did y'all do the whole 9 yards?
We did. We had a.
You can tell us about it Sunday if you want, I'll wait.
Yeah, no, we just we drove up there fast. We got there at 9 in the morning. We were gone by 3 in the afternoon.
You drove all night?
No, yeah. Well, we drove to Chattanooga, and it rained the whole way up there.
Ugh.
Yeah. Tropical storm Beta followed us all the way up there, and so we drove another 8 hours and got up Saturday morning and went to Washington. Got there about 9 or 10 o'clock, and then the march was over by 2, and we were on the road by 3 coming home. But it was really good.
16 hours.
Yeah.
Listen, when I turned that TV on and I saw all those people, I just started wailing.
Yeah, it was
So impressive.
it was overwhelming, really.
They never did get a real full count, did they? 50,000 was what I got that day.
Well, I can just tell you, there was more than that.
They said 50 was what they was guessing.
Yeah.
Oh man.
No, it was. They had registered 50,000 before it ever started, and I guarantee you, they were passing out badges like it was candy. So there was 100,000 people at least.
Did you hear the story about the Antifa group?
No.
That was on the hill, and everybody was coming, and they started shouting at them. The Antifa people started shouting at them and all this and all that, and so the Antifa people started waving hands and walking toward them. They took off running.
Oh, really?
But see, now this was the devil speaking. He said, "Do not let them touch you, or do not let them pray for you." And they took off running.
Yeah.
That was the devil, because he said, you know,
Yeah.
they fixing to get us delivered.
There wasn't a crossword. There wasn't a piece of trash on the ground.
That's what somebody said.
It was just.
They said it was remarkable.
When we started the day, the whole group, we were all at the foot of, we were right below where Mike Pence was. And there was about 15,000 people just right in that area. And he asked us to pray out loud for our leaders and to hear all those people praying out loud. Nobody was yelling and screaming. It was just, and it was really moving. And as we walked along, we would kind of eavesdrop in on different groups that were praying.
Yeah, they said that.
Yeah.
And they showed them.
Yeah.
I got a tape. I'm going to sit down and watch it.
We were two of the stations where they stopped, we were within hands distance of Franklin Graham and his bunch. And, but I couldn't see.
You
And,
know, he's Franklin is very down about all this. He's up spiritually, but he's very, it's almost a pessimistic. He's not pessimistic, but
no.
he's just so upset. He's grieved.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of people, when you talk to people that were there, they were glad to be there. But they have that same kind of thing. There's a grieving for our country because we don't really we've never, in any of our lifetimes, we never had anything like this. And so we don't really know what to do.
But you know,
And
I was telling you that other night that sometimes when you be talking, and especially being a preacher, but sometimes I'll just be talking about the situation and you just start crying and it's just it's just like the grief. You think about God, how grieved he must be if we upset down here.
Yeah.
What in the world? He's looking at all the evil and all the years we've let it slide.
Right.
That's his grief.
And that's what I think grieves us, is that we've kind of been neglectful of what we've been given. And that's never a good feeling to know that you've wasted.
Mark, how did our schools get in the shape sending children to these schools?
Yeah, I don't know.
And somebody said that today on the radio. They said that it was hard to believe that America is in the shape it's in.
It wasn't that. It's happened in the last 30 years.
Oh, absolutely. Since '62, he said. He said
Well,
it really started going downhill.
yeah.
It was already headed downhill.
I never experienced any of that when I was in school.
Well, you wouldn't have. You were born. You weren't even. When were you born?
I was born in '61.
Oh, all right. So how did you experience it? You didn't experience it because nobody objected to it.
Right.
Common Core came in and it just slid in and just
Yeah.
came in. And just
Yeah.
came
No,
in. All my kids went.
we had prayer every morning in school. You know, they picked a student or a student volunteered. You couldn't pick them.
That was a country town.
But Pineville, yeah,
It's country.
yeah, yeah. No joke. But anyway,
It's gonna be all right.
it's gonna be all right.
Thank God.
We all know who's in control, and we've been promised that there's gonna be days like this. So hey, so we'll be all right. You know,
In the end,
yeah.
I mean,
Be fine.
it might be we'll be all right down here, or we might be all right up there. We'll be all right.
When you recognize you're in the will of God, even bad's okay. You know, I had a friend who he was a pastor in Baton Rouge during the civil rights thing there, and he actually wound up leaving Baton Rouge because somebody lit a fire under his carport at his house with his family inside the house. So he was very vocal and open about his position on segregation and equal rights. And he said there was never a more fuller time in his life spiritually than when he was obeying that. Yeah. Because it is on the edge. A lot of other things that you obey in, you know where the obedience is going to lead you. When you sit and counsel someone in your office, you know, you're being obedient to that, and you know where that's going to go one way or the other. But sometimes God leads us and we don't know. That's when it really gets to be fun.
Yes.
Hey, how are you?
I'm all right, Justin.
Good. Well, we are gonna go ahead and get started. We're in 1 Samuel 18, and I mentioned before when we got to 17 that there's kind of this. David's anointed in 16. He finds his way into Saul's court. 18 is an expansion of what that means for David. So I've mentioned before that we really don't move through this in a linear fashion in time. There's overlapping, and there's certain portions that we read that magnify things that we've already been offered kind of in a summary statement. So when it says that David was in his court and he played his lyre and it soothed Saul, this is a magnification of what that is. We begin to find out in this passage how even though David is there to soothe Saul, it's not working, and we found out why it's not working. Okay, so in this is chapter 18. We'll discover that God, in all of His providence and wisdom, is still active through the spiritual lives of Saul and David to bring about what he is bringing about. So that David can't take credit, and he never does, by the way. David just kind of lets things come to him, and he doesn't even know it's coming. Whereas Saul is very, he is tense and uptight, and we'll examine all the words as we go through this. So as we go, there's some things by now that we should have learned to look for when we're reading 1st and 2nd Samuel. One of the things that we see is a great contrast between Saul and David. We've seen it already to some extent, but and it's all kind of done in secret because no one knows that David's been anointed to be king except who? Samuel, the narrator, and the reader, which is us. Saul doesn't know. Jonathan doesn't know. Nobody knows. So there's this contrasting thing that's going on between the two. Then the other thing that we are reminded of as we move through this is that when Saul was selected king, he was a king of the people. They wanted a king. We want this, we want that. And God said, okay, you can have what you want. He said, but I've got other things in mind. Well, in this chapter, we begin to see that Saul's not even really the king of the people anymore, because David, through no attempt of his own, is kind of offsetting that favor with the people. So everything is shifting, and we don't find God in this portion of the narrative. We certainly don't find Samuel anywhere. After Samuel butchers the Amalekite king, that's the last we see of Samuel for a long, long time. So everything that is being orchestrated here is already in motion by God. Nothing has to be really tinkered with here.
So how does he know when he takes over? I'm confused.
When David takes over? Well, we haven't gotten there yet.
But I mean,
So we're taking our
just hanging around.
Who right now? David? Well, he gets invited into Saul's court.
He killed a lion. He's back doing whatever. So
Well, yeah. So
he's
even
not hearing from God. That's what I'm thinking.
yeah.
He's not hearing from God.
No.
Okay.
No.
He's on his own.
All of this is ordained by God, and so we know that. And Saul's beginning to pick up on it toward the end of this chapter. And David knows that he's been anointed, but he doesn't share it with anybody. Okay, he hasn't been told to share it with anybody. He hasn't been given permission to share it with anybody. Okay, he just knows that he is. And in David's young, almost naive mind, that's all he needs. Okay, which is a lesson for us.
Yeah.
You know, when God's will is working, really, what more do you need? You don't really need a lot else.
When is God's will not working?
Well, there's times where we see in Saul's life where, Saul is not really ready to accept what the working of God's will. And I certainly know that we all experience that. And we will even recognize it for face value for what it is, and still try to make our life our own in some way. And that's what Saul's fighting now. He knows the truth, okay, but he doesn't want to face it. Okay, so it really begins to work on him here, mentally and emotionally, and it begins to affect him physically, you know. And so we're going to look at all that and begin to pull out some lessons for us as we live every day under the will and purposes of God. So verse 1 says, when David had finished speaking with Saul, and that is the previous passage there in 17. Other thing I want you to note. At the end of 17, David's just a commoner. I'm just a son of Jesse. Okay? Benjaminite, the smallest tribe, and we're the least known of all the tribes and all the people in the tribes. So that's David at the end of 17, and then by the end of 18, so his name became well known. So you can see from the end of 17 to the end of 18 just how expansive David's life is becoming. When David had finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan was bound to David in close friendship. That word bound means soul to soul. Okay, that's what the word would mean in the Hebrew. In close friendship, and loved him. The same word, ahab, depends on who taught you how to read Hebrew. But that's the word for love. And it's a particular kind of love. It's a love that's founded in a deep sense of commitment and mutuality with each other. Okay, so that's the kind of love that he's describing here. To put to bed any of the other theories that have been out there, there's whole books written on this being a homosexual relationship in the Bible, and this given foundation for homosexuality in the Bible. Well, that would be great if the words were right. But there is a mention of homosexuality in the Old Testament, and the word that's used for that is the same word that we use for no. So in the Old King James Version where it said Adam knew his wife. Well, we all know what that means. Okay, so that was the word that was used for homosexual relationship, not ahab. This is strictly the idea of this covenantal, mutual, sacrificial love that he had for him. Okay.
Relate to like the eros and agape and those other.
Kind of the same thing. Yeah.
But not eros, probably agape.
Yeah. No. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, agape is used for ahab, almost exclusively. Very few exceptions. So Saul kept David with him from that day on and did not let him return to his father's house. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him, same word, as much as himself. So now this is mentioned twice. Very important relationship that is being built here. Then Jonathan removed the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his military tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. So what do you think Jonathan is doing in this action? He's saying, I am not anywhere near the person you are, and you should have the royal. You should be the king, heir apparent. So Jonathan recognizes, without any anointing knowledge, that really David should be the heir apparent to the throne. Okay, which is important because we begin to see how David is finding favor, and he's not even trying. David marched out with the army and was successful in everything Saul sent him to do. Saul put him in command of the fighting men, which pleased all the people and Saul's servants as well. So now who's being pleased? The people and the people in Saul's house. So Saul is quickly, we will see, finding out that he can't escape David. He's larger than life.
Did you think he was hearing from God?
Saul? No indication at all.
Well, how did he know to do all that?
Who?
Saul.
To do what?
To David.
His anger boiled against David.
His anger.
You mean in bringing David into his house and all that?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he just liked David for what David could do for him. He soothed him, and he was a good warrior.
But he knew he was king, didn't he? Oh, he didn't even know yet?
Nobody knows David's been anointed but Samuel and the narrator and those of us reading Samuel. That's it. Yeah, nobody else knows. Jonathan is making a statement about David's kingship, but he doesn't know. So all of this is God doing his thing that he's put in place, and he's just letting it take the life that he's given it. Okay? As the troops were coming back, when David was returning from killing the Philistine, now the Philistine is Goliath, so now the time frame is kind of overlapping, so you got to kind of keep straight with all that. The women came out from all the cities of Israel to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with tambourines, with shouts of joy, and with three-stringed instruments. As they danced, the women sang, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. So they come out to meet Saul. They come out to meet their king. And really, in this little song that they're singing, it's probably Saul killed many and David killed many more. It's really not, the numbers don't matter. It's just a comparison. But there's no reason in this for anyone to think that David is in some sort of way usurping Saul, or that the people have come to any conclusion that David's a greater warrior. It's just kind of a song of fact. Okay? But Saul's anger and jealousy and the spirit that is on him has already begun to work in his heart. Saul was furious and resented the song. They credited tens of thousands to David, he complained, but they only credited me with thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? So he's suspecting, see. He's got a suspicious heart and a suspicious soul. So Saul watched David jealously from that day forward. So verse 9, he watches him with jealousy. Before that, Saul was keeping him close because he had favor with David. So in a very short 9-verse span here, he's gone from favoring David to being jealous of David. Okay, the next day, an evil spirit sent from God came powerfully on Saul, and he began to rave inside the palace. David was playing the lyre as usual, but Saul was holding a spear, and he threw it, thinking, I'll pin David to the wall. But David got away from him twice. Okay? So he's terribly unsuccessful now at everything that he tries to do. Saul was afraid of David, so he's jealous of David. Now he's afraid of David. Because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. Now this is a narration. This is not anything that Saul is believing. This is something that the narrator is letting us know. The reason why this is happening is that the Lord was with David, but the Lord was allowing the Spirit to work over Saul. Because this thing has to happen. And God knows the quicker that it happens, the better. Okay.
So yeah, that puzzles me or caught my eye. But the next day, an evil spirit sent from God.
Yeah.
God sent an evil spirit.
Yeah. God sent an evil spirit. So we don't like the idea of that God sends an evil spirit. But in Revelation, God sends angels to destroy the earth. In Job, God sends Satan himself to test Job. We don't like the idea that God does these things, but it tells us two things. Evil spirits don't do a thing until God allows them to do it. And generally, that is sent to someone who is prepared. Okay? When is the most famous is Judas. The devil entered into Judas. Okay? And he did what he did. Meaning that there was no way Judas would have ever done what he did on his own. There was no way that Saul would have reached this. This isn't a character flaw of Saul. This isn't something that is psychological or emotional. This is something that had to happen to Saul, sadly, to accomplish the will of God. We don't like to think that that's necessary. The other reason why this is understood as being necessary is because in 980 BC or earlier, this is how people thought of the world. There was nothing that happened in the life of a person that wasn't spiritual. We've got all kind of reasons now why things happen, and we ignore the spiritual. See? So it allows us to open up to the depth and breadth of how God works in the world. And that ultimately, if we learn to recognize it, the things that are truly influencing us are not the things that we see and hear and taste and touch, but there is another struggle going on. Paul describes we don't in Ephesians 6 that we don't strive against flesh and blood, but the principalities of the air. He says in 2 Corinthians 4 that we pay attention to the things that are unseen, because those are the things that are permanent, but the things that are seen are temporal and will pass away. So we're the Bible from start to finish reaffirms this idea that God is in control of all these things. And also, Saul could have avoided this, according to Samuel, right? If he'd have just done right, he would have been the king and his line would have been king. But he kind of took some things on himself that he shouldn't have. So, we'll get into the pastoral care part of that as we move through. But, David's got everything. Saul's got nothing. Wham, poor pitiful me. We can get to that place sometime, can't we? Yeah. And we have to look at the entire body of work, so to speak, to determine why life is that way. And then there's some that just get it, and the only reason why they get it is because they have favor. We don't understand it. We don't know why they got it and we got it, but it's the way life is. And so a good counselor, a good pastor tries to help us, come through those moments and begin to understand life for what it is. And then thrive in it, because you can thrive in either one. When you welcome God back in, or when you acknowledge what God is doing. So Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David and left Saul. Therefore Saul sent David away from him and made him commander over 1,000 men. David led troops and continued to be successful in all his activities because the Lord was with him. We're reminded again that the Lord is with David. This is not necessarily David. This is just the Lord's providence and presence with David. When Saul observed that David was very successful, he dreaded him. So he was jealous and afraid, and now he dreads him. It just keeps getting worse. But all of Israel and Judah loved him because he was leading their troops. So even Saul is, because of David, because of Saul's really becoming hatred of David, he's even finding himself separated from the people that made him king. So we see this whole thing unfolding more and more. And we are reminded twice that all of this has happened is because God is with David. So who really should Saul be blaming? If you want to be superficial about it, the first thing you should blame is God. Because he knows already that God's removed his hand from him. But instead he's blaming David. Okay? And he doesn't even know that David's been anointed. He just knows that David's better than him at everything. and it's driving him crazy. The people love him. And his son loves him more than he loves him. And we're going to find out his daughter loves him. Everybody loves David. And it's just thrown in his face all the time. And it's driving him crazy. So Saul told David, "Here is my oldest daughter, Merab. I'll give her to you as a wife, if you will be a warrior for me and fight the Lord's battles." But Saul was thinking, I don't need to raise a hand against him. Let the hand of the Philistines be against him. So he's thinking, he's going to marry my daughter. He's going to be one of the nation's princes, and he'll go out to battle leading the army, and he's going to get killed by the Philistines, and my problem will be over. Now, imagine that. I'm going to make my daughter a widow after she's no longer a virgin, so that I can kill her husband, so that I can have a little peace. Only David's not the problem. God's the problem the whole time. See how easy it is to lose sight?
Wasn't he promised her anyways before he killed Goliath?
No. He wasn't promised a daughter before he killed Goliath. In fact, Saul is so cynical about him going out to kill Goliath that he says, "Oh, here, yeah, take my armor. You're such a brave warrior." And it doesn't fit and all that stuff. And so he goes, "I don't need all this stuff." And he goes and he kills him. But he does when he goes out to kill the 200 Philistines he winds up killing. He knows the reward that's coming his way. Then David responded, "Who am I, and what is my family or my father's clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So what he's saying here is, I'm a nobody. In fact, it says, there's no way that I deserve this. Okay? So when it was time to give Saul's daughter Merab to David, she was actually given to Adriel, the Mahathabite, the Mahothalite. What is it? I can't say it. Maholathite, as his wife. So that didn't work. In the grand scheme of things, that didn't work at all. Okay, but he got another daughter that is much more interested in all of this than the oldest one was. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David. Outside of Song of Solomon, this is the only passage where it is mentioned that the woman loves the man. Remarkable. I didn't realize that until I was reading the commentary today. This is the only place of all the Bible, of all the Old Testament. I don't know about the New Testament, but of all the Old Testament, it's the only place. So here again we have this verification of just how loved David is. Okay, that even the writer says he's actually doing something that's not done. He's stating the love that the woman has for the man rather than the man for the woman. And if you recall, not a lot of these marriages had anything to do with love anyway. But here's one that does. Okay? So it speaks to the uniqueness of David and to the uniqueness of this particular union that's going to occur. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and when it was reported to Saul, it pleased him. I'll give her to him, Saul thought. She'll be a trap for him, and the hands of the Philistines will be against him. So Saul said to David a second time, you can now be my son-in-law. Now there's no explanation as to what Saul's thinking here.
Yeah.
There's none at all. It's like he's really losing it. Hey, if he marries her, then somehow or another the Philistines are going to be mad at him, and they're going to hunt him down, and they're going to kill him.
Kind of crazy anyhow.
Well, he's disturbed for sure. His spirit is disturbed. He's not thinking right. He's not behaving right. He just wants to get rid of David no matter what. So he's willing for this daughter to be widowed. Okay, and the same thing, no longer a virgin, and he's thinking of her as a trap. So he's talking about the subjugation of a woman. This is pretty bad by her father. Saul then ordered his servants, said, speak to David in private and tell him, look, the king is pleased with you and all his servants love you. Therefore, you should become the king's son-in-law. He's telling him, man, you move into the house, everybody loves you already anyway. It's not going to be a problem that you're a commoner, is what he's overcoming David's previous objections. This commoner business is not going to hold up. Everybody wants you there. Michal loves you. Jonathan loves you. All the servants love you. Come on in. Saul's servants reported these words directly to David, but he replied, is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law? I'm a poor commoner. So he comes back with the same thing. Okay. So what is David's motivation in it? What is the writer's motivation in this? David doesn't seize anything for himself. There's never a scheme that says, I'm going to be in the king's house if I marry his daughter. I'll have a chance at the throne. This is the way that God really wants me to do this. I'll manipulate and connive my way in, and that's the way I'll be king. That's the point of this, is to say, David's saying, that's not what this is about.
How old do you think he was?
Oh, I don't know.
Young boy.
Really, he's young. Yeah. So David is really the narrator, and through David is letting us know that I'm completely hands off what's going on here, which is really pretty cool. If you ever went to any church conferences or church growth conferences or pastors conferences, you hear a lot about manipulative ideas and calculation and all this stuff that's going on about what God can do through you, what God can do through the church if you do X, Y, and Z. And you read this and you're thinking, man, all David's being is David. And if God has put your hand on you to do the things that he's called you to do, you're going to do them. If you're humble at all in it, and if you're free to let God use you, it's going to happen. It took me about 30 years to figure that out. Shamefully, but it did. So that's what David's doing here. He has succumbed to the fact that that's just who I am in this. I'm doing great things. I've won some battles and people love me, but all in all, I'm still humble in my own skin. I know who I am.
You're saying David wrote this?
No, that's a whole nother subject.
You're saying David was narrating.
Yeah, no, there's a narrator that we read and that provides us with dialogue, and then he fills in the blanks. The servant reports back to Saul, these are the words David spoke. Then Saul replied, say this to David, the king desires no other bride price except 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies. Actually, Saul intended to cause David's death at the hands of the Philistines. So he's thinking, okay, it's not going to cost David anything. He's so poor and common. All he's got to do is bring me the foreskins of 100 Philistines. And he's thinking, no way. This guy will certainly be killed trying to accomplish this requirement or this request. So, actually, when the servants reported these terms to David, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. This changes everything. If I get to kill some of the Philistines for the price, I mean, this what could be better, David's thinking. Because he knows if the narrators let us know that Michal loves him, David's probably picked up on the fact that Michal loves him too. So this is a double thing going on here. He gets to kill some of his enemies, and he gets a wife that loves him. As opposed to most people in those days that just got a wife who just happened to be the right wife that the dad decided. So before the wedding day arrived, so there must have been an appointed day for this to be completed, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. So 2 for the price of 1. He brought their foreskins and presented them as full payment to the king to become his son-in-law. So he overpays. It's recorded as full payment, but he actually overpays. He outdoes even Saul's request. Saul can't even make the right request. He's just too small. He's thinking too small all the time. He's just imploding upon himself. Then Saul gave his daughter Michal to David as his wife. Saul realized that, now 28 is important. Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved him, and he became even more afraid of David. So now he's realizing, it's like the scales fell off his eyes and he's waking up, he's realizing, God is with him. He's not with me. He's with David. And so he becomes extremely afraid then. And also now his own daughter is just head over heels in love with David. So now what do I do with David? I mean, I can't kill him now. So he's really in a trap. And that's why he's become more afraid. Is because if God is with him and he has the love of his daughter who can really make him king if he's out of the way, then he becomes deeply suspicious of David, and he's got an evil eye toward him on everything that he says and he does from that point forward. As a result, Saul was David's enemy from then on. So he went from being David's king to now he's David's enemy. So he's made quite a change in this short little bit of time. Every time the Philistine commanders came out to fight, David was more successful than all of Saul's officers. So his name became well known. So here we have this great, as I mentioned before, we started in 16, and by the time we get to into chapter 20, the transition's pretty much made. And David is taking his rightful place that God has appointed him. But it's not easy getting there. It's not easy for anyone, oddly enough, except the people. They are the ones that are enjoying the favor of this. So you may recall when Saul was king, it didn't always go well. They would go to battle and they didn't do it right. They didn't respect the priesthood, and they tried to do some things themselves, and they were defeated. And then Saul didn't follow God's direction in destroying all the plunder and all the people, and that turned out to be a disaster. So we got this great contrast here of how, because God removed his hand from Saul, nothing could go right, and when God lays his hand on David, nothing can go wrong. I mean, nothing can go wrong. Saul throws a spear at him twice and can't kill him. He schemes 3 different times in ways to kill him, and it doesn't work. all these things that are happening here. And so we begin to really ponder the idea of God in our life. What is the presence of God in our life? Do we even approach that subject when, well, let's just face it, we generally think about God's presence in our life when things are going badly because we think it's not there. Or we think that he's mad at us and is punishing us in some sort of way. That's normally how we think of God when things are going bad. When things are going good, we about break our arm patting ourselves on the back thinking that we're all that. We're pretty good. And so we don't have a balanced approach of who God is in our life quite often. This passage kind of gives us an opportunity to weigh out the pros and cons of what that might be. Saul did some things that caused God to have to change his activity with Saul. Things are going to have to be different. You're not the man you think you are.
Is David aware of all these blessings?
The only thing that David's aware of is his anointing. He knows that he's been anointed because Samuel anointed him. But David never acts in that as though he is claiming it in all that he is doing. It is just there. It's a reality of his life. The man of God comes to David and says, "You have been anointed." The word Messiah is anointed. Okay? So if we look at the beginning when the people were asking for a king and God said, you don't know what you're asking for. This guy's going to take all your daughters and take all your young men and they're going to fight and he's going to take half of your property, and that's what kings do. That is not very good. Okay? But when he finally said, "But you're going to have a king, but I want one who's going to be a savior. I want him to save my people." And so when we started this, we began by recognizing that all that God was doing through Samuel, through his servant Saul, and now his servant David, is for the good of the people. So this is not egocentric upon David, although the story is really focused in on David. And because we know the rest of the story, we know that David is the father of Jesus, the ancestral father of Jesus. So we carry all of that and we put a lot of focus on David. But look at the people. When all of this transition is going through, are they harmed in any way? No. So God is still about his people. He's still about the way in which he is going to provide a savior for his people. And so when we look at our lives, we don't want to consider God acting through us in an egocentric way. When we begin to look at God in the egocentric way, where it's about us, and then when it's about us, what's the next natural step that happens when something is about me?
Humility.
Humility.
Well, it's coming next. When you're put in your place, you know what happens is you start protecting me. If it is all about me, I'm going to take care of me. Okay, you never find that in David's story until when we look in 2 Samuel and he gets to the whole Bathsheba event. And then we start looking at the effects that has throughout the rest of his time. We begin to understand that it was never about David and should have never been about David. This is about the glory of Israel, the glory of God's people. So as a part of his church, let's just put it in that context, and God is working in your life, it's never about you so much as it is about the people. Because once it's about us, we've lost it. That's what happened to Saul. Saul was told he was going to be king, and then he was told you're not going to be king. Well, once you've been king, and then somebody tells you you're not going to be king, you're gonna fight. And once you realize there's a threat against you, you're gonna fight even more not in a protracted way, in a very defined and purposeful way. And that's the brokenness of sin. That's the brokenness of living a life without the hand of God on you, see? And we have this great picture here to examine. And really we keep waiting. When you work through all of this, you keep waiting for Saul to just say, yeah, man, God's right. He told me all this, and this is the way it is. David, if you're the guy, you're the guy. And with deep humility and trust, I'm going to step aside. But sin doesn't allow us to do that. See, because he'd already moved himself away from God. The last worship service we attend is when Samuel whacks up the Amalekite king. I mean, worship is not a part of this, and it should be for Saul. He still is in that place where he should be calling worship for the people, but it's not. We don't even see any of that in this. Now, granted, this is a very compact series of events that is occurring here. We just have been able to look at it in a protracted, several chapter presentation. Okay, but we don't see it later either. So Saul has really moved away, where before he took on the priestly role himself, and that got him in trouble. Well, now he's not calling on a priest at all to do anything. See, so his spirit is not even there. Of course, David doesn't either, but David's not supposed to. He's not king. He has no responsibilities in that. Okay. The one thing that David does know that no one else knows is that he really is king. Okay? And that he's got to wait. He's waiting for all of that. Now, David, we don't have that in the narration. We're not privileged to what David is thinking, but he's probably putting some things together and thinking, wow, this is how God works. You know, the God I've been a part of up till now has let me kill some bears and, you know, do some things like that, and I took the head of a giant. That's a pretty good day. But when he begins to, I'm sure he's beginning to see the big picture here, and begin to think, man, I'm just going to let this work because this is an awesome God that's able to do this. I mean, killing a bear and a giant's one thing, but to do all these things in the lives of his people, to bring about what he is doing through me, it's quite remarkable. So we get that same privilege when our eyes are open to it, because God is working through each and every one of us in some sort of way, and not just to make us more than we are. It's to allow us to be his servant to his people, like this entire thing teaches us to be. So that there's two lessons in that. One is, if that's something that's on your mind, then David had a holy man that came and showed him. He had someone that was in tune with God to help him understand what his life was going to be, and that God had chosen him for that. So we all should have someone in our life that is kind of a spiritual mentor. They help us understand these things. The other thing in that is to humbly receive it. David, I'm sure there's times where David could have said and wanted to say, "You old man, I'm king," but that wasn't a part of who David was, because he exercised a sense of humility. When he killed Goliath, he didn't even take credit for the bears and the lions that he had killed. It was God that was doing it. And he was going to go out and he was going to slay Goliath like he'd slayed those. God was going to slay Goliath like he'd slayed those bears and those lions. So facing down a 9-foot man in full armor with a sword probably longer than he was tall, we say it took a lot of courage. It really was an expression of known faith, of a known experience with God. So he had no doubt, which is remarkable. We all face those times, and sometimes we foolishly go and face our giants. without knowing that, hey, this has God really shown himself to me and like this? Well, he probably has, but you may not have recognized it. But sometimes we can foolishly go and believe, well, I'm going to do my best and God will pick up the slack. Got to do something. And the lesson that we learn from that is, no, we don't do anything until we know God's going to do it with us. So that's that. And that's kind of where this whole chapter is for David. Everything that he does, David's doing it, but we're constantly reminded because the Lord was with David. And so when we're reminded of that, we need to remind ourselves of that. Are we doing what we are doing because the Lord is with us? Are we fearless?
How do you get to that point?
Well,
You don't just happen.
no. I think in David's life, he got to that point because he was spending much time with him in his
Process.
early days, in his developmental
And
days.
you were watching those sheep.
He was watching those sheep, and he marveled at the God of the heavens. He marveled at the God of the earth. He marveled at God. When he would do things that he knew he wasn't supposed to do and incapable of doing, like killing a bear, he marveled at God
Fast
in
forward
that.
to us.
Okay. So, what was the first thing I
Just
said?
the average person.
Time.
Time.
Spending time.
Alone with God.
You know that. You do that.
I know, but it seems different back here. It seems like we should be even further along than what David is because we have so much to draw us to God.
Yeah.
David had just a bunch of sheep sitting out in the wilderness by himself. Now, maybe that's where we need to go. Get us some sheep and go. I mean, just really go take ourselves somewhere and it's
Yeah, I think.
'cause I'd love to have what he got.
Yeah, I think the period in history is not as important as just understanding our human nature. And so, we build a world of distractions today. We want to fill our lives with distractions because we're. Any psychologist will tell you because you're afraid to be alone. Okay.
Well, this is a good time with this epidemic and everything that's going on and the craziness in the world. Seems like that would be driving us to our prayer closet.
Well, it should, if we understood what Sabbath is for us. Okay, and Sabbath is what? Sabbath is that time that we say God has asked for and we've set aside that we are going to ponder just the nature of God. We're going to ponder who He is. We're going to spend that time, that day. I mean, they had a 24-hour or more period of time where the family rested, and this was what was on their mind for that day. Was God, see? So we don't generally, we don't take a Sabbath very often.
Distractions.
When I think that I'm going to take a Sabbath the way I read it in Scripture, I wind up filling my time studying or doing something, which is not bad, but it's not what a Sabbath is. A Sabbath is that time where all of that's set aside, and it's just this overwhelming presence of God that we seek and appreciate. So David was living that probably every day. I was with a guy herding sheep one time when we were in between Montrose, Colorado, and ultimately Purgatory ski area. Let's just make that clear. and it was about 3,000 sheep with this, and the dog did all the work. He had a sheepdog that did a much better job than any human being could ever do at keeping those sheep together. One dog, ran, I know it did 50 miles a day. I've never seen anything like it in my life. And so it was easy. I mean, really, you sat on a horse and you just watched. And you marveled at the dog, how smart the dog was, how fast it was. Okay. So you did have a lot of time. You know, you had to pay attention, but you had some time. And I imagine David had a lot of time. So the first thing, I think, to get to that point is we make time for God in meaningful ways. And I think we do it with a heart and mind that marvels at Him. We tend to take God for granted because ever since Jesus came on the scene, He's been our friend. And so we tend to think of the whole idea of God as this friendly relationship that we have going on. People call Him the man upstairs and all sorts of names that never rise to the reverence that we're to have for God. Now, Jesus came to be our friend so that we could understand that we have a friend that suffers for us. But if you ever leave out the idea that Jesus is a friend and you leave out the suffering part, you don't understand what it means for Him to be a friend. So you trivialize it. It's cheap. So we tend to cheapen those things. All right? So time. The other is, before God ever anoints David, what does He say about David?
He's the man after His own heart.
Yeah.
It was in his spirit.
See, God didn't do that. His eyes are searching everywhere, and His ears are open to everyone. And He comes upon David. What a heart that guy has for me. So how did God know this? At some point along the way, David expressed it. Okay? You don't just internalize these things and then have meaning for your life. You can tell yourself over and over in your head, well, what would you say about yourself that you I can't even think anything. I'm so pitiful. I can't even think anything. What would you say over and over to yourself that's going to make you a better person? Can't really think of anything, can we?
God is one.
And you're getting no help either.
I know y'all are as bad as me. I'm glad to know I'm in such good company. Anyway, my point is
First of all, God is in you.
my point is this: no matter how much you talk to yourself, you're not going to change yourself.
That's correct. Only
Okay.
through God.
Until it's at an expression of what you desire for yourself, it's really not going to change. It's just a made-up story in your head.
Okay.
Okay. So when you're outwardly expressing to God what you know to be God and how you love Him and how you are devoted to Him, God hears that. If you seek Me, I will be found.
I desire.
Well, that and
want
when
it.
I think when you face some of them trials, like coming up on a bear, or and all that, and then he trusted God. I mean, he asked God for help, obviously, and then when He helped him, it gained his trust.
That's the outward reality, see? It came to life. He prayed about it. He maybe even sang about it. And then when it came time, David said, bear's a bear. It's God's bear. He'll take care of the bear. I'll take care of my sheep. So there's that. So there's time. There's having a heart for God. Okay? What else is involved in this? All the way through this passage even. There's a deep humility. David's humility in this, is over. See, we don't like to be alone. We'll if there's 5 minutes of silence and there's a phone nearby, some people they can't handle it. Mm-hmm. They remain alone, but they feel like they're not alone anymore. They'll play a game. Interacting with the game even is better than being alone, or Facebook, or all these different things. As long as I'm not alone. And God is there with a horn going, you're not alone. Talk to me. I want to hear from you. I want you to know who I am. I desire you more than anything. See, that's what's going on that we never pay attention to.
I think, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No.
That he played instruments and all that too. I'm sure he was praising God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Psalms are not just poems, they're songs. you know, and they were written to be played with certain instruments. The Psalms tell us, and a lot of David's are, yeah,
I like that scripture, be still and know that I'm God.
yeah.
I say that all the time to myself.
Lips be still, huh? Instead of peace be. I say that to myself. Yeah. Well, you were talking. You were talking. I was just answering. Okay. So this is David, and we kind of get a picture of that, and we want to be that. This is the pastoral reality of things. Is that we want this. We want to be these people. You know, the shepherd that is shepherding you wants you to be this person. Because we see all the good that comes afterwards that David never has to lift a hand to achieve. It's just God on him. Okay, so that's what we want. Then we look at the other side of this, and we see everything that's wrong. And it starts with the fact that God's not with Saul. And when we look at, remember, we don't look at these things linearly. God's hand was removed from Saul, but then we look at all the reasons why God's hand was removed from Saul.
Yeah.
And then we begin to understand, you know, as approachable and available as God is, He's still God. And we are left with doing things the way that He is determined to do them. Okay, and Saul wasn't in line with that. He was reactive. He was not patient. He was kind of impulsive in the things that he was doing. And then there were times where he would blame others. Oh, my men brought those, all of that plunder back. So he didn't really have any confidence in what he was even doing with God. So you can spot a person pretty quick that is at a level of no confidence with God. They want to be, they claim to be, but you can tell they got no confidence. They're unsure about everything that they're saying. They're unsure about what they're to do next. They're unsure. They can take a simple passage of Scripture and get it all twisted and turned around because God is not there. Now, He wants to be there. I mean, He's there. God's everywhere. I mean, He's omnipresent. But what I mean, when I say there, I mean, we've engaged Him. We've sought Him out and found Him. Like He promises will happen when we seek Him. But so many people, even Christians, just don't seek Him. Because He's our friend and He's always going to be there.
No, we're just busy.
Yeah.
Be true.
Yeah. Or we're busy. Or He understands. Or all these various things. And that's just not His way. And the Old Testament makes that clear. And we know that God didn't change anything when Christ came. He fulfilled everything when Christ came. So we have a deep abiding responsibility to our own lives to God. And then when we recognize that and live in it, the purpose for that is everyone else that will benefit from it. So once David is finally king, he's a king of the people. Because that's who he is. And the one time David makes his life about himself, what does he do? A grievous sin. That just the more you chew on it, the bigger it gets. Like a bad oyster. It just keeps getting bigger and you don't know what to do with it. That's what happened to him.
Big old oyster.
Yeah. That's not the best analogy, but it's the one that just popped into my head right there. So we find that, okay, and David could have done like Saul, bristled, and I'm going to bull my way through this because I'm king. But that's not what happens, and we'll learn the other side of that. In fact, what's kind of ironic about this whole thing is that Saul tries to do to David what David ultimately does to Uriah.
Mm-hmm.
You see that?
True.
Yeah. So David's even better That's all it is. The Saul's not very good at anything, but it's kind of a foreshadowing that we see in this. It's David should have known right away. That's a bad solution.
Right.
See, not that he would have known that anything that Saul was doing at this time, but in that glimpse of time, where's the hand of God on David?
Gone.
Yeah. David said, I'm not seeking God, I'm seeking Bathsheba.
It's
God,
a
you stay over
whole
there.
different
Leave me
thing.
alone while I seek Bathsheba.
I think he knew he'd have to pay the price.
See. Well, he was king. See, I think it was creeping into his life at that point that I'm the guy, is what he's saying
You
at that
think
point.
he knew he'd be punished for doing what he did to Bathsheba?
I think, I don't think he thought he was going to ever get caught. He tried to cover it up, you know. But he couldn't hide. Couldn't hide from God.
But he didn't.
He couldn't hide from God. That's the whole point.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's the whole point. Is that, but David's in that moment when we get to that. I don't want to trample on it right now too much, but when he gets to that place, David's already decided that he's king. And see, up until that point, it's been God is king and David is servant. But when he begins to focus in on himself, it all of a sudden becomes David is king and God is, where's God? If God's not king, then where is God in our life? Outside the camp. See, he's outside of us. And that's important. That's an important thing. And this long and drawn out thing with Saul is a painful reminder of that. And we've probably been through maybe shorter expanded periods of our life where we knew that either our actions or our attitude or spirit that was in us had just caused God to move away. Because what does God have to do with sin? Nothing. So there we are. By the grace of God, we have a Savior in Christ Jesus who says, but I can forgive you of that sin. If you will just do what? Call on me. Seek me. Same thing. If you seek me, same word. If you call to me, it's all the same thing. And so that's what we're at. So another thing that David probably had learned to do, one way that God knew that he was a man after his own heart, was that David probably spent some time calling to him. Nobody's meant to be alone, and David was out there all alone. Mm-hmm. But in his aloneness, he discovered two things. God knows me and he loves me. Now, what could be more valuable than those two things in all of life? The God who made me knows me, and the God who knows me loves me in spite of me.
He had a godly, his family had a godly background. David's family, and they knew about God.
We assume. They knew what a sacrifice was because Samuel showed up with one and they went to it. Well, see, we don't know a lot of these things. We assume some things about them, you know. And it's not wrong to assume that because the people were devoted to God and they knew they had already experienced hundreds of years of moving away from God and being in trouble and then calling out to God and him coming and helping. The judges, how many times? I don't even remember how many judges there are, 11, counting Samuel, I think. So they knew that who God was and what he was, that he was there. But they probably were like us. He doesn't get the attention he deserves. He probably didn't get the attention he deserves then. And so we kind of get caught in that same thing, I think, sometimes.
Amen.
And the other thing about it that we can look at briefly, I think we got what time is it? 7:39. Is that there's two things going on here. This was quite an individual experience that David was having with God. Okay, And God's hand was acting through David in a very specific and individual way. Okay? So that everybody comes to love David, but God's never mentioned. There's never this idea in the people's head, that's God working through David. Okay? It never comes out in the story. Only from the narrator do we know that God's hand is upon him, see? So either it's an understood thing and taken for granted, but I don't think so, or he wouldn't have mentioned it. Or this is to call out to the fact that God only needs one person that he can work through to accomplish anything that he wants to accomplish. But he's got to have the one, and why is that important?
Self-will.
Self-will, but he wants us to understand his activity in humanity. That he's not a God here that is somehow sprinkling pixie dust in a way where these things happen. But God has the ability to work through the life of even one person to accomplish the expanse of his will. See? And that applies to us as well. That he can use the one person that's willing, that's able to humbly surrender. Isn't that what we talk about in New Testament language all the time? We take up our cross daily. We humbly surrender every day, and we follow Jesus so that he can have his way with us in life's journey. And we know that it's better than our way because he's God. And he's our friend. And he suffered for us, and he died for us. We can trust him. And so David had a trust, and we likewise have that trust. Also, when Jesus died for our sins, he died for his Father's sins. No sin escaped the cross, past, present, or future.
Say that again.
When he died for our sins, he died for David's sins. No sin escapes the cross. He did it for the world. And so when we imagine ourselves in the world and God using us, and we don't know exactly what that means in this time and place, you got to think about the 1,000 years later that your life may have great meaning. You don't know. All you know is that if God is willing himself through it, then that's all you need. Yeah. David probably didn't know what all of this meant until God came to him and made a covenant with him, like he did Abraham. That I'm going to do this through you. And then, by that time, and David's not a young man then, he's beginning to see just how remarkable God is, because he's come through all these things, and he hasn't been the best servant, but God is still able to use him and wanting to use him.
Well, that's like us today. We go forward, we fall, we
Yeah.
stand up.
Yeah.
2 step forward, 3 back.
All because of what's here. You know.
You know, we have to keep going forward.
Yeah. The other remarkable story in this that we really didn't touch on, kind of ran right past it actually, because it appears again in more detail, but the whole relationship between Jonathan and David. Jonathan has a like attitude to David as David had to God in a sense. He's willing to surrender everything because he recognizes who David is. Not necessarily that God's hand is upon him, but he's recognizing David as this remarkable person. We've heard a lot about Amy Coney Barrett the last few days, and the thing that strikes me most about what everybody's saying, hardly anybody that knows her ever talks about her legal mind. They're constantly talking about what a gracious and genuine person she is. It's like she overwhelms people with who she is personally. You could take the legal side out of it, and you would still she's the kind of person you would still search the world to meet because she's so wonderful according to all her friends.
She's one of
Okay.
the charismatic Catholics. too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something to investigate.
and so that's kind of David. David has this presence, and it's especially expressed in his relationship with Jonathan, that he's just this overwhelming figure. And so Jonathan probably he surrenders himself really to David, maybe not for the right reasons, but ultimately God uses that for the right reasons. And Jonathan does discover, there was no other way for this to happen. And becomes a loyal soldier of David's. So.
Well, charismatic Catholic is a good thing. I wasn't making fun of it. I mean, it is.
Yeah.
It really is. They're more,
Anyway. So I'm going to tell you folks good night and goodbye.
Well, it's working well, huh? Did you go get something? You got your,
New camera, and we got